Okay. Hello, it is my pleasure to welcome you today to the second event in the SIWI Seminar series on Connecting Expertise, Information, Governance, and Justice for Climate Resilience here at the 2021 World Water Week in Stockholm. My name is Josh Weinberg. I'm a program manager at the Stockholm International Water Institute and the UNDP Water Governance Facility at SIWI. I'd like to begin by thanking all our convening organizations, the US Water Alliance, UNDP, the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute, the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, and the Stockholm Environmental Law and Policy Center for arranging this event with us. Before we begin, a couple short housekeeping notes. First, all attendees are automatically muted. Please double check this on your end that you stay muted. This helps minimize feedback and ensures that everyone can hear the panelists. This is an interactive session. Questions and feedback are welcome, but please, this must be submitted through the chat on the World Water Week Pathable platform. Also, if you want to view the live transcript, you can turn on the CC button in the menu tab. Let's begin. Perhaps you are like me as you join this session and begin by thinking, why connect information, governance, and justice with climate resilience in one session? Those are a lot of big issues to tackle at the same time in 1 hour. Well, here's an answer. If we aim to build resilience faster, we must look at these three big issues together. Resilience in the face of climate change will require the best possible information is used within effective governance systems that are grounded in an understanding of justice. I'll state that more simply. To respond to the climate crisis, we have three musts. We must know, we must act, and we must care. And these must be connected. We must know what we can know. We must be able to act based upon what we know. And we must care about those who will be affected on how we act, and where we don't act. Decision makers must know more because our capacity to collect, utilize, and respond to climate information can be of life and death importance. Technical innovations to provide accessible and up-to-date forecasts to guide early warnings for flood and other events inform actions that save lives when disaster strikes. We heard examples from our session yesterday, where improved climate information services supported by the FANFAR program in West Africa alerted actions taken for thousands to leave before floods destroyed their homes. This is just one example, but it also required more than the forecast data provided. It resulted from governance systems in place that could process information so that responses came in time and with adequate resources to execute. Our government systems must integrate the climate information that is available, which may show both high levels of risk and high levels of uncertainty, and then act accordingly to guide investments, interventions, and infrastructure planning to both reduce and cope with potential risks. Moreover, we must care that the impacts of climate change will hit vulnerable communities harder than others, and this will not change without proactive approaches that consider justice. We know that the capacity to prepare, respond, and invest to address climate risks is not equal between or within countries, communities, and regions. We must care for justice in our governance so that we hold decision makers accountable to take actions that ensure the water and climate security of all citizens. The question for today is how? How can we link climate information into better governance for resilient and just development? In yesterday's session, we heard of many valuable tools, insights, and experiences into how this is taking place in different examples around the world, from across Asia, Africa, North America, and Australia. Today, we look forward to you joining us for a discussion on this topic, led by an excellent panel that brings diverse perspectives, including from indigenous communities and across the UN system, as well as extensive expertise in climate science, human rights, and disaster management. I'm honored to introduce our esteemed panelist and moderator. Dr. Hans Gutmann is the Executive Director of the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. Hans has worked for more than 25 years with water resource management and was previously the CEO of the Mekong River Commission Secretariat. Erik Sellström is Professor of Climatology at the Swedish Meteorological and Hydrological Institute. Erik has extensive expertise in the application and analysis of climate modeling data for use in decision-making. Ms. Joyce Mendez is co-founder of the Youth for Water Network in Paraguay and member of the World Youth Parliament for Water in Brazil. Joyce is a social entrepreneur, an accomplished author and lecturer, and an expert on the water-energy food nexus and transboundary cooperation. Ms. Samira Savarala is a climate change specialist at the United Nations Development Program. Samira works actively on global policy issues, with particular focus on the Paris Agreement and supporting island nations. And Ms. Janine Yazzie is Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Six World Solutions. Janine works with Diné Navajo communities to promote sustainability, environmental justice, and self-governance. She also co-founded the first Navajo Nation community-led watershed planning program. The discussion today is moderated by Jan van de Venus, a human rights lawyer and the founder of Just Law. Jan serves as the Ombudsman for Future Generations and is a member of the UN network Harmony with Nature. Finally, I encourage you also to enjoy our next interactive session of this seminar, entitled Making the Case, Can Climate and Water Justice Be Achieved Through the Courtrooms, which will take place twice. First on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Central European Time, and also on Thursday at 5 p.m. Central European Time. Thank you once again for joining us today. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Josh, for your eloquent and profound introduction of this session and of the theme, a matter of justice and a matter of information to ensure justice and governance is realized. Thank you so much for that. And I think without ado and without any delay, I would give the floor to Joyce. Joyce, please, will you introduce us in a short intro on your part of this theme?
Yes, thank you very much. So I will say, País Chapá, or sejam muito bem-vindos, buenos días, buenas tardes, bienvenidos. Gracias por esta oportunidad. Y yes, basically I want to talk a little bit about how most vulnerable communities, especially when we talk about, from my experience from Latin America, South America, Amazon communities are impacted mainly for issues regarding water and sanitation, but not just this, is regarding the governance perspective, and as well the nexus regarding water security and citizenship participation. So basically we have seen mainly to put an example, during this pandemic, that access to information, when we see we have these global agendas, how we can translate this into regional but local action, and how we can engage local community, I'm talking about indigenous communities, traditional communities, into the building of this agenda without actually imposing a perspective or pasting a model. So I have seen that basically we see water, energy, and the food nexus, the security of this nexus is being compromised during this pandemic, and how we are trying in communities in order to answer and mitigate this, is that, as I said, translating this into action, but using participatory methodologies. Mainly, we use social cartography in order to hear the knowledge from not just our ancestors and traditional communities, but also mix it with science to be translated into public policies. So these participatory methods allowed also like to listen, to understand the reality, to go into the logic of the communities, and to have even a bottom-up approach as well. So in this way, we have developed, especially I'm talking in the transboundary regions, like the border of Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, the Iguazu region. We have developed public policies based on environmental education, climate adaptation, and water and sanitation. So I see that it's actually is a logic, but it's also kind of a tango of several actually points. And one of them is also, as I said, transboundary cooperation, but it's also intergenerational dialogue and inclusion of youth during this process. Because as we cannot see sustainability in the long term if we don't include and not just empower, but also allow youth to take action, to catalyze the action, and to actually trigger new different solutions. And just to finish this part is that, especially I see for my generation, we grew up listening about climate change, the climate breakdown, the climate crisis. So for us, it's more a reality than just the future. So I see that this is fundamental for us to be these actors engaged in our communities, especially, as I say, bringing these intercultural approaches and mixing what we know as like traditional knowledge and as well as science. So that's basically what I wanted to bring at the beginning. And is at the end, it turns out to be a construction of collective intelligence to tackle these challenges from a local, regional, and global perspective, or a global perspective. Obrigada. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for this beautiful outline and a very clear view. And I will hope to hear more of you also from the youth perspective and why we should really have youth on board and not just as a last checkbox, but have youth on board at the start for any solution on climate resilience. Before I give the floor to Hans, I would really like you all to be aware of that you can, in the chat, pose any questions that you will have during the session. After 3:40, we will open up the floor and I will have those questions submitted to our panelists. So you will see it where Tavita and Katie have just added something in the World Water Week chat session. So, but without further ado, Hans, please, can you help us show also how people can become more prepared for impact and disasters?
Thank you. And let me start with 2020 will be remembered for the COVID-19 pandemic, then 2021 is perhaps already on the way of being remembered for weather extremes and perhaps leading to action needed for the addressing the climate change. I mean, heat waves in US and Canada affecting thousands, killing hundreds, obliterating villages through wildfires and cause untold damage to property. At the same time, we see extreme floods in Europe, typhoon, cyclone, hurricanes across coastal areas in most continents and compounded by the impact of the already ravaging COVID-19 pandemic. So the call for preparedness for and resilience to disasters of all types is really deafening. But what are we talking about in practical terms? I mean, the devastation and loss of life in the floods of Germany last month is shocking. Not by the numbers, as the casualties, however tragic, are well below such floods in many other countries. No, they are shocking because Germany and the Rhine River system has one of the most advanced early warning systems in the world. Rainfall and flooding were predicted, information was available and disseminated, but many people still who received the information did still not know what to do. They did not grasp the scale and the urgency. And we need to make sure that the warnings are understood and those who get the warnings knows what to do and have a capacity to act. This is end-to-end early warning systems that are reaching the so-called last mile, reaching those affected. But in all of this, there is some good news. I mean, preparedness and investments in disaster risk reduction works. The Netherlands, downstream of Germany, was much less impacted. Investment in management of the river and canals and much higher level of awareness of the risks and actions taken led to much reduced impact, and this is good because this is something we can control. Nonetheless, as the summer of extremes is turning into autumn, the extremes may keep coming. The latest assessment report, number 6 out of the International Panel on Climate Change, paints a gloomy picture based on the scientific evidence of our changing climate. Extreme weather events, floods, wildfires, drought will be more frequent and more intense. And to my surprise, there was actually a CNN article this morning which echoes what I'm right in this statement, which I was writing last evening. So it's very pertinent for the moment. In adapting and building resilience, we need to recognize that the impact these extreme events have on our society. And since this is World Water Week, I wish to make it clear that the changes I just mentioned about will have direct impact on the application of integrated water resources management, which I believe needs to bring extreme events closer to the center and recognize these events or disasters, how they shape our communities in significant ways. Finally, before ceding the floor to our other panelists and you in the audience, I want to make a point about equity and fairness. Disasters are not indiscriminate. People's ability to be able to cope with disasters vary greatly, and due to economic status and access to information, etc., and the fact that in many cases, people with lower coping capacity are also in areas that are more exposed to disaster. Therefore, equality and rights are important issues in the context of disaster risk reduction and climate resilience. The right to help and support in disasters is important. The right to equal access to information and to equal treatment during displacement are also very important and recognized principles. But we need to turn these principles into action and make them practical to guidelines and standards. How do we design new evacuation systems when our population is aging? How do we ensure equal access to and ability to act on early warning? Just to mention 2 issues, and there are so many more. To this end, I would like to mention that ADPC, together with many of our partners, are working on framework for integrating rights and equality, or FIRE, in disaster risk reduction to help turning this important issue into action. With this, and with the constraint of time, I wish to thank you for your attention and look forward to our discourse ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hans, also for clearly setting it on the table that it is a matter of justice, it's a matter of human rights, and also that as we have long seen, it's a matter of inequality where people in the north who have contributed most to climate change actually don't feel the negative impact yet. And I think that has changed. You made it really linked to the present day society. This morning it was in the news, Hans, that these disasters, these tropical rain clouds that we've endured here in this part of Europe actually have 8 times more risk to happen again than before climate change. So we better be prepared. And you've shown us where is the information, what can we do with the information. Before we go to a central panel discussion, I would like to give Eric the opportunity to add to what it means to providing information to everyone who needs it. I think Hans touched upon it, and Eric, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I would like to add to that and just say that, first of all, of course, that information is really essential here, to have basic information about the climate, both the historical climate, so we know what we are comparing with and what we started from, and also today's climate and future climate is really essential for adapting to what's happening. And it's also, of course, essential for the mitigation work as well. So this is, of course, a very evident thing, but it's not always the case that this information is there. Since there are some problems here, the information needs, of course, to be scientifically very solid, and that is the case. We have such information. We have the new IPCC report, for instance, and that's very good. So we have solid information, but that information is often provided on a global scale or a large regional scale, and these impacts and the floods are happening here where I live, and that's on a much smaller scale most often. So to get this right information at the local place where impacts are seen, that's a very tricky question, and that kind of information is not always there. And it takes a lot of work to really provide that information, starting from the global climate change scenarios that are available. So this is very relevant, and I think this should be stressed, and there is still actually scientific work needed here and further kind of climate model development, etc. So that's important. And I think this is especially important in an equity perspective, since there are many countries working a lot with this kind of information, but in other parts of the world, first of all, the historical data series are not that long, so we don't really know what climate was before. And that's still an issue actually in many places, and especially when you go into these really extremes, even in other places where we have more data, this can be a limitation. And another thing is, of course, that these regional, very high resolution scenarios, they are not even available in all areas in the world. The situation is getting better, and again, getting back to the last IPCC report now, the AR6 report, there was a very good atlas attached to it, so you can really go in and look at your region in the world. And to get good information also about climate impact and climate indicators that are relevant for impact. So that's very good. But still, I have to finally say that as well, the regions provided there are still quite large. For instance, for my part of the world in Sweden, our region also covers the UK and large parts of Northern Europe, and we have very different climates, especially in wintertime. And this is the same case for the rest of the world. So I will stop there, and thanks for this. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric, and I'm sure we'll hear more of you. Thanks for this contribution. And now onwards to Samira to highlight the element of justice and inclusion. Samira, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you all so much for having me. It's so lovely to be here, and this is indeed such an important topic. This is actually my first World Water Week, so it's quite amazing to hear all these perspectives from water experts around the world. And I come more specifically from this climate background and looking specifically at the Paris Agreement and how countries are meeting the pledges of the Paris Agreement. At the heart of the Paris Agreement, we have what are called NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions, or essentially the climate pledges that countries are putting forward to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement to keep global temperature rise to 2 degrees at the max, and 1.5 really is the focus right now, 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in order to do this through these NDCs, we found that this is a way for countries to really start developing these climate plans in country in a whole different scale. This is unprecedented. The Paris Agreement was agreed to in 2015, and now we're 5 years later, or 6 years later now, after the Paris Agreement. So how far have we come really in this time? Countries are expected to submit their NDCs every 5 years. So it's already been the 5-year mark since the first round of NDCs were submitted, and they're already starting to enhance their next round of NDCs. So why am I talking to you about NDCs when we're trying to talk about justice and governance? And NDCs have really proven to be a way for governments to work with stakeholders across society in developing climate pledges in an inclusive way. And we're finding that there's some governments that are really leading the way in doing this and have approached UNDP and our partners to really get a sense of, okay, how do we make our next NDC more inclusive? How do we make it more ambitious? I think the focus primarily is often, NDC ambition means mitigation. How do we reduce our emissions? But this time around, in this round of enhancements for the NDCs, we're finding that countries are saying, actually, ambition is different for us now. We're talking about adaptation. As some of the other panelists have mentioned, we are already facing the impacts of climate change. Joyce, Eric, Hans have already mentioned so many of the ways that we are already facing a lot of these consequences. So the adaptation piece is something that's being added to NDCs when originally they weren't a strong part of the NDC, as well as resilience elements. And then inclusion is also a huge part of ambition. You can't have an ambitious NDC that has these high mitigation targets if it's not developed in an inclusive way, if it doesn't involve all the stakeholders, particularly those that are most vulnerable in developing these NDCs. And that's a matter of justice as well, which is also what we were discussing earlier. When you do not have the most vulnerable and the most marginalized involved in these discussions, you're really not developing a resilient or sustainable NDC in the long run. You're not getting to the heart of the matter. You're not involving the people that will actually be most impacted by these pledges and by these policies. And we find that the NDC is now an opportunity to really put all of these different pieces together in a way, again, like I said, in a way that has not been done in the past, in climate in particular. that really sets in stone how a government will move forward. So when the government is developing the pledge, they are involving more stakeholders this time around. I just want to give a couple quick examples. For example, in Lebanon, in their new NDC, it better aligns with the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's promoting a whole of society and inclusive approach, which they did not have in their previous NDC. Somalia has now integrated gender and youth concerns into its NDC. Again, this was not there in the previous NDC. Chile has really focused on just transition and gender equality. How do you make your NDC gender responsive to include the concerns of women and girls in particular in the country? And then finally in Cambodia, also a more inclusive NDC with recognition of gender and vulnerable groups. So these are just some examples of how countries are starting to put this into their NDC, and now we're focusing on implementation. So how do we involve these groups in implementing the NDC, actually achieving those pledges that they've made within their NDCs. But I've covered a lot of information on these climate pledges and on the Paris Agreement inclusion, but I'm happy to answer questions and look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Samira. And to all, a very happy development is that Janine, who was offline, happens to be online and got some new Wi-Fi connection. Janine, if you can you please unmute yourself and do your 3-minute, 4-minute part on the contribution on indigenous communities? And if you cannot, I will take over and we will continue. So I hope you can. I see Janine is on a phone, but she cannot respond. We'll try to get her back on board later, trying to mute her as well. Actually, this morning I gave a lecture to the Indonesian National Human Rights Institutions on human rights and climate change. It's a topic that is not close to my heart alone, but something that I work on. And I hope that Janine manages to add to that later. But the indigenous communities are not only hurt the most, they are actually part of the solution for us towards a more sustainable future, one that is more connected to nature, where we are always looking at information more as data. They actually know the information before we see it. They see the disturbances in the environment. They know that there are issues with the water, with the plants, with the animals. And we see, luckily, in law as well, with changes into rights of nature popping up, human rights and biodiversity, human rights in the environment. The Human Rights Council will rule over a decision to get the right to a healthy and clean environment acknowledged in this Human Rights Council session. It's the indigenous that can help us lead the way. I hope that Janine can add some later on, but I had to put this here as well. But onwards to some questions and some debate between the panelists, or debate, maybe we can add to each other. Janine, do I see you just unmuted yourself? Can you talk?
Hi, I think so.
Excellent. The floor is yours, please.
Did it work? Okay, you can hear me. All right.
Yes, we are all listening to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so sorry for my technical difficulties this morning. I'll try to shorten what I was going to share today. But yes, Indigenous peoples have historically been on the front line of a lot of the challenges facing our water issues, even before climate change impacts have gotten as grand as they are now in this day and age. A lot of our struggles were rooted to continuing to access and protect and maintain our relationship with our water resources, and the holistic approaches that we took and being able to carry out those practices, and the impacts to our water resources from generations of environmental extraction, as well as of land theft. And those threats to Indigenous peoples' lands, territories, and resources continue to increase and continue to be ongoing across countries across the globe, but particularly here in the United States. We can see it. We've seen a lot of attention get drawn to these issues from Standing Rock, but these have been longstanding issues in many of our communities, particularly in my community, the Navajo Nation, which has been trying to raise awareness and bring attention to the issues of uranium contamination across many of our communities, as well as the threats to our water resources from hydraulic fracking. But we're also seeing more frontline resistance, like what's going on to resist the development of Line 3 up in Minnesota. And yes, it's just ongoing. And part of what has made our struggle so difficult is that Indigenous peoples have been kept from having access to the real data, the water data, that would inform effective management and governance over these very precious and life-giving sacred element. I think another problem is that we're forced to address what is very sacred and what is very precious for all life, using the term resource, which is, by the very nature of how it's used in the Western world, an indication that it's something there for us to take, something there for us to use, and really ignores the reciprocal and sacred relationship that is necessary for good governance and sustainable governance, not just for our use, but for future generations. And so when we talk about things like the rights of nature and a lot of these new legal designations that are being developed to recognize the right to a clean and healthy environment, it concerns Indigenous peoples a lot. We're split globally on this direction that's being taken because we know that these legal systems and institutions themselves are inherently structured to look at, rule, and govern water resources in particular as a resource that is prioritized for development projects and for projects in which there is private investment or there's funding available to it. And so there's more. Living under that reality, we know there's more money to use water for fracking than there is to build water, like drinking water lines, to communities that have not yet had that type of community infrastructure invested in to this day. And so it's important to flag that. Like Indigenous peoples are positioned and have been fighting to lead what it does look like to transform these systems to be more holistic and sustainable and conscious of governance around water in a way that upholds its sacredness. But if we look for quick legal fixes without looking at all of the other things around our consumptions and our human habits and our histories and behaviors as a society, as communities, and as parts of colonial governments and institutions, we're not going to be making the transformation that needs to happen to restore our relationship with water. And I'll go ahead and end there.
Thank you, Janine, for this, and also for showing us how we need to connect, and most of us need to reconnect to water and to the value of water, and that things like rights to nature can never be used to get out a single point, but it should be used to represent the wholeness of the whole community of life that is supported by the rivers, by the ecosystems, and by this nature that we are part of. So the fellow nature that we humans are part of. Thank you very much. And I think it starts with the future generations, and the future generations start with our youth. So Joyce, can you continue, or can you add a bit on why this is so important for us to get reconnected? Why it is so important? It's important for us to have youth actually. Yeah, I'm almost shy to say, but have us lead the way as adults, because we are lost. And you've shown, many youth have shown to be great examples of what real maturity would mean in this world. Can you show us a bit more, or tell us a bit more on what it would mean and why we would have the youth participate more?
Sure, yes, of course. So actually, like, continuing maybe from what Janine was talking about, especially to mention this part of like this paradigmatic change, actually, is that whenever we're trying like to build this sustainability, it's not just by replacing the technology, but really understanding the logic behind it. And I think that this is exactly what we can contribute as youth, because as I said, we have kind of the mind and the way to make connections and to make innovations. I'm not just talking about technology, but social innovations and so on. Yeah, because as I said, we are already born during this climate breakdown. So the way kind of we see and we understand the world is different. And at the same time, I see youth throughout like the examples and the experiences that I've been part of. We catalyze, that means we make faster this transition, but also like that's bringing obviously the innovation, but also the knowledge, and mixing these kind of two worlds. So I just wanted to talk to you like about like 3 examples somehow like youth, like we have kind of impacted in a high level, and even policy making. So one of them is with this like the Youth for Water Network in Paraguay. So what we started doing is like we started having youth in different areas from like the government, public and private sector, companies, and so on. So actually, like they are part of our organization. We try to create a movement and a space where youth can understand not just the challenges, but to bring the research and to create this network. So what we are doing actually is even from translating information from Spanish, English, or also to Guarani language, which is our local and native language. So for people to have access to this information, but at the same time, as well as we see in the other way, like initiatives like, for example, Blue Peas, we see youth in the front lines actually doing research, transboundary water research, and suggesting for policy making and water diplomacy. These not just policy, but also like solutions and citizenship engagement towards conflict prevention. And the last example I wanted to bring is from one another of an organization I co-founded, that youth were actually leveraging and like producing the data, getting the data from these participatory methodologies, plus this science behind like the climate scenarios. And we have created actually 3 projects of public policies in the region. So we can shape the territories with obviously the access to technology, with our creative minds. So this is kind of from my example what I can tell, that yeah, it's not that we're the future, we are the present, and we are really concerned about this, because you know, like if we don't act now, we're not going to have a safe future for anybody.
I fully agree, Joyce. Thank you for this and for stressing that you're not something that we are waiting for. You're here and we're impacting your today. Absolutely right. Hans, if you hear this and you see the link between youth, between human rights, indigenous people, and you're also involved in hydropower development plans, how can you make the link between equity, information, human rights, and setting up such a program properly, including the food, water, energy nexus? Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Sure. To start out, perhaps I'm not really directly involved in hydropower development, but I've been involved in the issue for some time. And I mean, we have to be clear on that hydropower development and many of the issues in water resources, damming, etc., they are inequitable by definition. They tend to concentrate positive impacts and distribute negative impacts, whether we're talking about generation of power or irrigation, but then impacts on the environment, disruption of fisheries, etc., are a distributed one. Thus, the governance around these issues are central, and especially dealing with the negative impacts. Now, we have learned a lot over the years. There is still a lot of controversy around these areas, but I think climate information and the impending change that is happening is putting an onus on how to potentially repurpose or at least reprioritize the purposes of some of the existing dams, and be very careful about positions of new dams if we're sticking to dams in this. And I mean, this has been done in the US, in other countries for quite some time. But in countries where perhaps hydropower development and uses of dam are a bit less developed or hasn't been done for so many years, the focus is still very much on energy and irrigation. And that may have to shift, maybe not for irrigation, but certainly for energy in dealing with flood management. And I think we have examples of management of the dams in the 2011 flood in Bangkok. I'm residing in Southeast Asia, so it's a very pertinent memory. But I think when we're talking about this particular issue, and you were referring to hydropower, risk management would need to focus on two real aspects. Dam safety, and then the flood and drought management, and potentially water quality and environmental issues. And the first one is really construction issues and management issues and safeties and guidelines and standards. But the second one needs to be considered in a broader concept. And I think there, bringing it in the context as you were asking, this is going to be upset by climate change. Construction of dams, etc., was dependent on historical records, which are important, but they are changing. Now, what do you want to use it for? And if you look into the future, those future users cannot be necessarily dependent on what the current users are. Because yes, we want water for certain purposes, but if dams are put in certain places, you may want to optimize them more specifically for flood retention or water use in dry season, if this is an area. So I'll leave it at that to not take up too much time, but I think it's a very controversial issue. And I think the perspectives, and certainly perspectives of the users in the future, needs to be reconsidered in the context of existing and new plans.
Thank you, Hans. And as time progresses, we have resulted to enter the phase of Q&A with the audience. And I've received 2 questions from the audience. Please feel welcome to add more. Don't be worried that that the audience or the panel will be silenced, because as you can hear, there's lots to talk about anyways. I would like to address the first question, or to have this answered by Janine and then Samira. And this is a question from Malaysi Shivaji. I hope I pronounce this correctly, from Kenya. And he says, or she says, how can we best promote climate resilience for the most in need community through the Paris Agreement? At the moment, the countries that are most affected by climate change are invariably those that have the highest disparities in access to safe water and sanitation. So the biggest lack of safe water and sanitation. And at the same time, they lack the requisitive expertise to develop well-designed, nationally determined commitments and deal with climate change. So how do we best promote climate resilience for people not living in the richest countries of the world? Samira, is that a question you would like to answer or have comments on?
Sure, yes, thank you, Jan, and thank you so much for that important question, Malaysia. I think that what we found specifically through our work in supporting countries in their NDCs is there is an interest in some countries, of course, to build that capacity so that they are able to address these concerns within their NDCs and find ways to acknowledge some of these areas that they didn't consider in their first NDC, including water and sanitation. This is, of course, an integral area for anything related to climate and environment. In terms of what we found that works is, it depends on the countries, of course. They call it nationally determined and country driven for a reason. It depends on the interest of the government. But also we found that it's important that there's that finance aspect as well, so that there is money that is coming from those bigger emitting countries, historically bigger emitting countries in particular, to really ensure that countries are able to reach the pledges and achieve the capacity and the resources that they need. Ensure that that technology and that expertise is really being shared across countries. There's a $100 billion finance goal per year that was agreed upon, and that has not been achieved or met yet. And that was to happen by 2020 from the larger emitter, wealthier countries to the more vulnerable countries, and that has not been met yet. And this is a big thing that we're watching for the climate conference at COP26 in the UK this year, is how do we ensure that this is met, which is a global justice issue, of course, as well. But then also looking specifically at NDCs, there's also been a lot of South-South, as we say, cooperation in this area. So that how do countries learn from each other? How do agencies such as UNDP and other partners really help to build these cross-country connections to ensure that what Kenya might need, a neighboring country might have that solution, or another country in a similar circumstance might have a solution or might have included water and sanitation within their NDCs in a way that might make sense for another country. So that's another option, is to look at how other countries have been facing this issue. But in particular, it really has been, trying to find ways for governments to really include stakeholders and scientists and other groups that they don't usually include, people with disabilities, in particular with resilience building. How do you include those groups in developing the NDC? So I'm sorry, I don't have a very direct answer to your question. I know it's a tough one, and it depends often on the circumstances, but we're definitely looking into that, and that's important to think about. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Samira. And Janine, if you can unmute yourself, if you would have anything to add on that. How do we get this this information? How do we promote climate resilience for the indigenous of this world, who are often far away from Wi-Fi networks and the latest news? If you want to, you can unmute yourself and add a bit to this. If it doesn't work, I'll give it a few seconds. No, well, maybe I will see you when you unmute. There you go, Janine. If you want to add, please add.
Okay. I've learned I have to probably try to do that a few times, but yes, I do want to add two thoughts. One is that we need to recognize the human right to water and sanitation everywhere. Until we do that, it's hard to prioritize the effective and holistic solutions that are needed to actually meet that right. The second thing is that, I always get a little uncomfortable talking about what developed nations need to do for so-called underdeveloped nations, because it ignores the whole history of neocolonialism and continued resource colonization and undemocratic influence in other countries' development priorities that are very much at the root of why so many lack access to critical infrastructure, are living in disparate and inequality conditions of inequality. I know this because I'm from a developed country where our own reservations are living under the same conditions of many places in these so-called developing nations, because of the reasons, because of the very real history and conflict between indigenous peoples and colonial governments, and the ways that we look at our responsibilities to the world, and the way that should inform development for current and future generations. It's not just about money. It's really about us investing in the type of solutions that are people-led, that are decentralized, that are sustainable, that are regenerative. And to do that, we need ecosystems-based approaches, and we also need rights-based approaches. And the only way that gets developed appropriately is by doing what Samira said, by centering the most vulnerable that are often kept out of these decision-making processes. And when we think about like what happens at COP and what happens in these international fora, it's a quick scan of the room will tell you that often none of those people are at those very tables. And so I think that we're challenged right now. We're challenged right now to completely shift everything that we have taken as and normalized as the way decisions get done around big development questions, and dismantle it and change it and recenter and refocus those who are made most vulnerable, not because of some happenstance or some circumstance, but because structural oppression and structural inequality is a thing that was manufactured and continues to exist. And unless we can name that and intentionally approach the situations that are of our frontline communities that are dealing with the impacts of colonization, as well as climate change, as well as political inequality and financial inequality, we're not going to be able to even identify, let alone invest in the solutions that need to be taken to ensure that those populations achieve the human right to water and sanitation. And you also can't like look at it just in those terms. It's not just the human right to water and sanitation, it's to good food, it's to ecosystem functions that create climate resiliency and that support biological diversity in these areas, that restore and protect the soils and their fertility, despite the rising temperatures or despite the changes in seasons. And our youth right now who are inheriting this world and now stepping into positions of leadership around the globe, they need that radical transformation in order to have a foundation on which to lead as our new climate change thinkers and leaders of consciousness.
Thank you, Janine. It's not just a matter of data and of numbers, but also about reconnecting and of connection. Thank you very much for again stressing this. Eric, you would want to add to this? Anything? Also on sharing climate knowledge, modeling, how people get to the data?
Yeah, I think it's very important to stress here, and many things have already been said, but I would also like to stress that it's not, of course, not just about the information, it's about how to make this information useful. And I think here it's some climate science and data is quite difficult to understand perhaps, and it needs really good interpretation. So what is needed are also people in between scientists, climate scientists, and people in the field who can help in this interpretation. So I think that's very important in this context, and building up a local and national competence in all of these areas that's available and present in many countries, but not everywhere. And it's not just a national thing here, it's also a sectorial thing. I think it's different between different sectors, like the energy sector and the agricultural sector, that can be very different in different parts of the world as well. So I think this is important, and the fact that the useful information is most often what we produced in a co-productive way. So we work, climate scientists together with people working on the impacts together with people in the field. So you can work all people together. And then that's finally when you get to the right questions. So it's really important to be able to involve all of these different people that we have been talking about here, both the young people, both the indigenous people, and also people in poorer countries or in poorer parts of the world. So that's highly important. And I think we have good experience from that, working and also trying to assist in building actually local scientific competence in these areas. I think that's very important as well. So, okay, thanks.
Thank you, Eric. And I think we get an interesting, it's more of a remark, but I would like you guys, all and girls, to reflect on this. It's from Cindy Lorena Ospina Gallego. And she actually said, it seems that the only way that we young people have to work on the international cooperation organizations is to work on WASH. To do this through existing big cooperation organizations. And she actually proposes there should be financial opportunities for professionals, and I would say for young professionals in the water sector, to start small organizations in their own community or cities in developing countries to getting support from international aid for capacity building. Any of the panelists who want to reflect on that, is that a good thing, something we should support? Just take the floor, one of the panelists. Hans.
Yes, I'll take the floor from a similar intention, but slightly different perspective. In 2016, there was the World Humanitarian Summit, which ended up with a grand bargain, which basically committed big organizations, big institutions. When we are working on humanitarian assistance, we need to increase the proportion of resources given to local agencies, local response organizations. At the time, back in 2016, it was about 3% of the total support for humanitarian assistance went through smaller organizations. 97 went through international large organizations or governments. Now we are still at 3%, although the commitment was to get 20% by now. So we're far away, but the principles are there. And one of the obstacles has really always been, how can you ensure that the funding that is being provided are used in a proper way? So we actually, and working with others, have tried to emphasize that not only is technical capacity important and the ability in setting up, as was recommended in the wash sector and others, local agencies that work with local solutions and local things. But a critical element is you have to be able to account for and handle the money in a way that is acceptable to the ones that are providing the funds. Otherwise, there's a non-starter, and we have been struggling that for many years. And we have recently also started saying, look, it's boring, but accounting is important here. If you're going to have the startups, you need to account for the money. And then you will be given credibility to be able to get more money and do more good things. So maybe it's not a solution, maybe it's an advice, but we do that in the areas of humanitarian assistance. And I think it would be applicable across many areas of the water sector, and also in risk reduction and other areas where we're working. So just my contribution to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Hans. And with all good things in life, time flies. And I think this last one also to remind us of the bottom-up initiatives and not just to do everything top-down is a very good one. Let me start by with a very small wrap-up. I think many things that were said were about climate resilience is about information, information, information. It's crucial. It's crucial to cooperate with each other on climate impact, as it will impact many more than just others and a small group. It is a matter of justice. It's a matter of dignity. It's a matter of human rights. And I really like the elements that for me stood out in this session. Information is not just about data. We need effective mechanisms. It was said by Josh when we started. Thanks, Josh, for that. We need to know, we need to care. And if we balance that, then we act. I think this was also stressed by the youth perspective, the indigenous perspective. And it is also stressed by human rights language. All human beings are born equal in dignity and rights. The first article of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights says. The second article that many people do not know, the second line is, they're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood. I should add to that. So it requires action, action that is based on wisdom. I really want to thank everybody who added to this beautiful session. Definitely the organizers, Katie and Jenny, who have done a lot, but also the speakers, and especially to you as well, all the people that contributed to the chat, through the chat, who were here with us today. So let's continue to work on climate resilience, and let's continue to work on justice. And to remind all of you, this session was recorded and will be available on demand on the World Water Week website. It was the second of 3 sessions in the World Water Week seminar on the Tango, Information, Governance, and Justice for Climate Resilience. If you missed one or the first session with the keynote and storytelling is also available online. And we'll also hope you'll join us on session 3, taking place twice to accommodate different regions of this planet. So join us on Wednesday, 25th of August at 10 CET, or on Thursdays, 26th of August at 5 CAT. And do contribute and do add. Climate litigation is one of the most fast development fields that's actually creating a big change in climate change mitigation, because it's forcing people and recently also companies to change their business. I'm proud to work in that field, and I'm actually looking forward to participating with you to these sessions. And also in this session, Professor Jonas Ebbesen from Stockholm Environmental Law and Policy Center will introduce some of those recent court cases on water in relation to climate change. And you will have the opportunity to engage in group discussions and reflections with participants from all around the world, and on expectations on other lawsuits, how litigation efforts can be leveraged, and how to achieve justice. Thank you all so much. It's 4 o'clock. Have a great World Water Week, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye from all of us, and thank you on behalf of all the panelists. And panelists, thank you. Bye.